Hello, welcome to today's lesson for Spanish translation. Today we're going to talk about that fourth and really critical step in the translation model, which is the reformulation step or reformulation phase. And we're going to address in this presentation these three questions that you see on the slide. What translation unit or segment size should the translator focus on? So we'll talk about translation units. Which procedures should be used to resolve individual problems? So we'll look at translation procedures. Some people call them techniques or strategies. I'm going to call them procedures. And then finally, we'll take a look at what tools and resources will be the most effective. So those are our three kind of subtopics: translation unit size, procedures, and tools and resources. Let's get started. All right, so if you recall, I've been reiterating this quite a bit. I have this 5-step model of translation that I propose, and we're going to focus today on the fourth step, which is the reformulation phase. In this step, what we're doing is we're actually translating the source text by applying translation procedures. So we've gone through steps 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 2 kind of go together as we've discussed. You're interpreting and analyzing the source text, trying to determine what it means and how it creates that meaning. Third step, you're pausing to think about what will an effective translation look like. Will it be more literal? Will it be more free? What types of equivalence orientations are we going to prioritize? Okay. And then finally, we're diving into our translation. So hopefully we've done steps 1 through 3 before we just get started on step 4, which is sort of that translation proper, where we're reformulating the source text and creating the target text. So again, if we look at Mildred Larson's, again, my favorite sort of graphic or visual representation of the translation process, this model, she has the source text, we discover the meaning, that's that interpretation and analysis phase. Once we've determined the meaning of the source text or specific source text unit, we strategize, we think about what an effective translation will look like, and then we move on to, only then, right, do we move on to the reformulation phase, which in her model she calls re-express the meaning on the way to creation of that receptor language text, the target text. So we're going to focus on this highlighted area in this presentation, the re-expression or reformulation phase. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the notion of the translation unit. Now this comes out of translation studies, translation theory. The translation unit is the source text segment that the translator looks at or focuses on when looking for an equivalent in the target language. So we know, you guys have done translations, when you look at a source text, certain words or phrases kind of stick together and you realize almost intuitively or through experience that the equivalent has to envelop or take into consideration one word, 2 words, 3 words, an entire sentence. So translation units can be individual words. Look at the red box here, the word acquisition. This particular source text on this slide is a corporate quarterly earnings report. I used to translate a lot of these, so I'm familiar with them. So it can be an individual word, and they often are. The translation unit or segments are often very short, individual words. Or they might be phrases that go together, like depreciation and amortization. That's a phrase. Its equivalent is an equivalent phrase. Or the first quarter, acquired assets. A longer one like impairment losses on property, plant, and equipment. So as you look for equivalents, you're going to look for equivalents for these target language or source language units in the target language. So I just wanted to emphasize with this visual the fact that your translation unit, when we talk about where's the problem, what do I need to find an equivalent for, those can be of different lengths. Words, phrases, clauses, sentences, even entire texts if we're looking at a super creative or free translation. Peter Newmark made an interesting, I think it was Peter Newmark, one of my favorite translation studies theorists, made an interesting observation when he talked about the correspondence or the association between, usual correspondence between the length of source language units that we're focusing on and the translation approach. And he said that the more literal the approach, the shorter the translation units. The freer their approach, the freer the translation approach, the longer the translation units. Now that's not always true. We can have long translation units like this final green box here that we might end up translating very literally, okay? But in general, I think that's an interesting sort of rule of thumb, right? So if we're doing a literal translation, or if we notice that we're focusing on very short translation units, individual words, short phrases, we're probably, odds are, doing a literal translation, a faithful translation. If we notice ourselves kind of looking at longer translation units, ideas, clauses, long phrases, sentences, then we're probably in the realm of the free or kind of creative or artistic approach to translation. I wanted to show you guys examples, having trouble thinking today, examples of translation units in a text. Now, we may or may not have seen this text in class, but just to give you this idea that sometimes the translation unit will be short. In other words, what are we focusing on to find that equivalent? And sometimes it'll be longer. So the first translation unit or segment in this text, source language unit, is La Trinidad. So that's a very short two-word translation unit phrase. The third bullet point I have here, de la Iglesia del Monasterio Toledano de Santo Domingo el Antiguo, misspelled there, but it's Santo Domingo el Antiguo. You have to unpack that entire lengthy phrase to look for its equivalent. Okay, and you can see I have different examples here. In the source text, there's a translation unit in quotes. It says, organizada como, quote, trono de misericordia, close quote. So if you're looking for an equivalent, you're going to have to look at that three-word phrase as your translation unit or segment, trono de misericordia, and you're going to find throne of mercy. That is the equivalent. Okay. When we talk about translation procedures in a second, I think that's a really good example of a calque, something that's created from or modeled upon, calqued or traced from the source language. Throne of mercy. Shorter one like Dios Padre, God the Father, or El Cuerpo Muerto de Cristo, right? So these are those units that you can't really break apart when you're looking for equivalents in the target language, okay? A longer one like Los Sumos Sacerdotes del Antiguo Testamento. I put that all together because I'm probably going to translate that as Old Testament high priests. So it's one unit. It's not several units. So you have, again, we're kind of going against that thought by Newmark that the longer the translation unit, the freer the translation approach. Right. Because if we look at a unit like Los Sumos Sacerdotes del Antiguo Testamento, that's a long one, but we're still translating it fairly directly, right? Because when I say Old Testament high priests, that's still a literal or direct translation. It's not a creative or free translation. I'm not saying something like, the priests of the good book. That would be an extremely literal or free translation. I'm still using a literal translation. I might be mixing up my terms, but you know what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to kind of rush through this video. I don't want it to be too long. All right, I think that's enough about translation units. Just remember that the translation unit is the source language unit or segment of text that the translator focuses on when looking for an equivalent. Speaking of looking for equivalents, that's what we're doing when we're applying translation procedures. So remember in our last video or a couple of videos back, we talked about translation approaches as sort of being the toolbox, right? We know the nature of the job, the project. We grab one of our toolboxes. Is it the plumbing? Is it the framing? Is it the carpentry? I'm not really, a handyman, so I'm just throwing those terms out there, all right? But the translation procedures then are the individual tools that we apply to resolve a specific problem. So let me go over these points on this slide, okay? So what's a translation procedure? Translation procedures are the specific procedures the translator applies when reformulating or finding equivalents for specific source text units, right, into their target text equivalents. Okay, so as I just mentioned, translation procedures are like the tools in the translator's toolbox. It's that specific tool I use to fix the specific problem. That's the procedure. Again, some authors will call these translation techniques or translation strategies. That's fine. I prefer to call them translation procedures or the tools in the toolbox. So there are lots of different procedures that translators apply to resolve simple and also more complex problems as they translate. If you look at different books about translation, I've got a couple right here. Fairly new textbook that's out, an older textbook that I've used before, you are going to find sort of these lists of translation procedures. Okay, so we'll talk more about specific translation procedures in class. I have a handout that you may have seen already. I'll make that available on the class Blackboard site. to me, like I've mentioned perhaps before in class, it's not so important that we remember what these different authors, but this author, great textbook by the way, Antonio Jimenez, and this author here, I relied on this one for a long time by Hervey, Higgins, and Haywood, the 3 H's, okay? So I gotta give a shout out to these people for their great work. But I'm not so concerned that you remember the exact names of the procedures that are on my handout or that are in these textbooks. For me, the important thing to know, you might forget the name of a tool in your dad's toolbox or your mom's toolbox, okay? But the important thing to know is you have a specific problem, there is a tool, right? You have the option. So like the last bullet point says, being familiar with specific translation procedures, whether you know their name or not, helps the translator know what his or her options are. So you might be thinking, I'm wondering if I can do X, Y, or Z when I reformulate or translate this unit. The answer probably is yes, and that's why it's good to sort of know what's on these lists of procedures. Here are some examples. And like I said, terms different for these strategies, techniques, and procedures. You might use, one of them might be called a loan word transfer. So for example, if I say to browse the internet and translate that as navegar el internet, internet obviously is the same word. It comes from English. That's a loan word transfer. It's not being translated into Spanish. It's being borrowed. That loan word is being borrowed and used wholesale in Spanish, maybe with some phonetic phonological adaptation. Instead of saying navegar el internet, I might say navegar el internet. Let's pronounce it more in accordance with Spanish sounds. But also I have the label lexical equivalent because navegar is the standard accepted translation, the lexical equivalent in this sense of to browse the internet. Okay. What if I come across a source language or source text unit like the Argentina, Texas Chamber of Commerce, and I decide to translate that fairly literally, directly, just making adjustments for the target language syntax and grammar structure requirements. So I say Chamber of Commerce is Cámara de Comercio. That in and of itself is a standard translation, lexical equivalent, if you will, for that phrase. And then I add Argentina Tejana, right? So I'm observing the target language rules for grammar, right? Making it feminine, Argentina Tejana, and I'm putting it in the right order. So in a sense, this is a calc. Okay, we've talked about that particular procedure, but it's also a direct translation. What about something that's a little more situational? I see someone enjoying their lunch, and I say, the waiter might say, right, or the server might say, hey, enjoy your meal. I hope you enjoy your meal. In a Spanish-speaking country, in a Spanish-speaking context, they're not going to say, disfruta tu comida, which would be a very literal, direct translation, calqued upon the English. They're not going to say that. They're probably going to say, provecho or buen provecho. Okay? That I'm calling a situational equivalent. And again, the names vary depending on the author. Another example, or couple, or 3 examples in this next segment. Visitarán la ciudad de Sevilla. They will visit Seville. This is a direct translation. In other words, I translated it literally, each element with its closest lexical and grammatical or structural equivalent. But I just made the necessary changes in order. Although in this particular example, I don't need to change the order of anything. They will visit Seville is the same as visitarán la ciudad de Sevilla. What I've done is I performed another procedure called omission. And here I might pause just again to reiterate, I don't care if you forget that it's called omission, okay? But I want you to remember as a translator, can I do that? Is that an option? Yes, it's an option when it makes sense, when it results in an effective translation, okay? So you don't really lose anything in this particular segment translation. Visitarán la ciudad de Sevilla. They will visit Seville. I've omitted the word la ciudad and its equivalent. Also, it's a standard translation in the sense that Seville is the standard translation for Sevilla. Okay. Look at the final example on the slide. And again, these are just some examples. There are many, many more ways to resolve specific translation problems. There are many more specific translation procedures. We have the segment Fuentes de energía solar y eólica. And I translated that instead of sources of solar and wind energy, or solar and wind energy sources, I translated it simply as renewable energy sources. What I'm doing here, I'm combining the idea of solar and wind in the adjective renewable. This is a type of generalization, going from something specific down to something general. Wind and solar down to renewable. So again, on this slide, I'm just showing you some different strategies and applying different procedures. Okay, so remember, translation procedures, what are they? They are the specific solutions, the specific means in which the translator resolves specific problems in this reformulation phase. So if we want to go down even one level more specific from procedures, we can talk about tools and resources for the translator. And this will be our final topic in this lesson, all right? So what are tools and resources for the translator? What I'm referring to are the actual resources that translators use. Professional, amateur, right? Even the most professional translators you can imagine use many of the resources on this slide. So the actual resources that we use as translators, beyond what's in our brains, beyond our own knowledge and experience, when we actually apply translation procedures. So when we're resolving the specific problems during the reformulation phase. Now, many translators who are working as freelance translators, independent contractors, in-house translators at a large company, they are working on some kind of CAT tool. Remember that CAT stands for computer assisted or computer aided translation tools. What these are, they're things like, I'm going to throw out a corporation, a brand name here. They're things like SDL Trados, right? They're software suites that are designed for translators, designed for professional translators. So they have several functions, typically 4 or 5 different functions or more built into one software suite. They'll typically have a machine translation function. They'll have term bases or glossaries. In other words, specific glossaries or lists, bilingual lists of terms for specific domains. So it might be surgery, it might be vehicle sales, it might be environmental regulations. So you working in that particular CAT tool will create or import or use someone else's term bases so that you're using terminology consistently. They also have translation memories, and lots of times translators and the providers of these CAT tools consider this particular function the key function. What this does is that it's sort of a form of machine translation or automatic translation, because what it will do is if you scan, right, or import a source text, it will go back through its memory and look at the different translation segments, whether they're short phrases, longer sentences, paragraphs, things like that. And it will look back in its memory to find if you've ever translated that before. And if so, it will show you the match. And it will show you what percentage. Oh, that's a 97% match, right? A near perfect match or a fuzzy match, right? If it's below 95%. There's these different terms for the accuracy or the proportion of match based on what you've translated in the past. So if you put in a document and you see several segments that are coming up as 99 or 100% matches, you know this is going to be an easier job, and you can rely on that translation memory to automatically translate those segments, which it will do. You can, of course, go in and edit them if you want to. And then another function that CAT tools typically have is some kind of proofreading, spell check, punctuation checking, those types of things. And sometimes they'll also have project management tools. So CAT tool is a professional industry level tool that some clients and agencies might make available to translators so that they can work more efficiently, more accurately, increase their output, basically. There are other things that professional and amateur translators use on a daily basis as they translate. I like to call these FORTs, or free online resources for translators. So these are things that we all have access to, even if we can't afford an expensive CAT tool. Of course, there are dictionaries when we're looking for the right word, that lexical equivalent. We're going to look in bilingual dictionaries. Those are online. And monolingual dictionaries also, to make sure that the word we're looking for means what we think it means. Okay, so there are some very, very good, of course, language pair specific. If it's English Spanish, English German, German Dutch, whatever, you can find high quality bilingual dictionaries online. And you can find them dictionaries that are so good that really it's questionable whether or not you need to buy a paper dictionary. Another resource or tool, free resource or tool, obviously, that translators use, and we hope language learners don't use them as much, but they do, we know that from research, is machine translation. So something like Google Translate, a website or a smartphone app that will automatically translate from one language, source language, to the target language with an increasingly high level of accuracy and effectiveness. So machine translation, Google Translate, that's another function, free online resource for translators that many amateur and professional translators will use frequently. Of course, search engines like Google, right? They help us perform research. Many times we'll be given a source text from a particular domain or field that we know very little about. It might be about hydroelectric, dams. It might be about decorations in a Broadway theater. You name the topic, right? It might be about tolls on highways. I'm just thinking about some of the projects I've done, right? That I really had to do some research to make sure I was understanding what the source text was saying, even when the source text was in my native language. Search engines are great for looking up images. So if you want to make sure that particular object that the source text is referring to, that you have the same mental picture in your mind, do an image search, a Google image search. Or if you want to see if the equivalent that you think is correct and appropriate refers to the same thing, Google that and look at the image that the results return for that. I also use Google or search engines, usually Google, who are we kidding here, right? Who uses Bing? Sorry, Microsoft, to verify hunches. Because especially if I'm translating into my second or third language, then I may not be 100% certain that the term I'm about to use or the terms I'm about to use are appropriate and correct. So I might Google those and see if I can find them used in the same way in a text written in the target language for target language readers. Parallel text aligners. One example of this is the website Linguee, Linguee.com. What they do is they align parallel corpora, right? So a text written in language A, same text in language B, usually a translation, and they align those segments and you can look for specific terms. So that's extremely helpful because basically it allows you to see how previous translators have translated a term. You just need to make sure that they were using it in the same way. Peer-to-peer forums. I know that wordreference.com, I'm plugging lots of the tools that I like to use. Wordreference.com has some great forums. So you can ask about expressions. How do you say this? How do you say that? I'm translating this document. I came across this. And then finally, a great resource, it can also be an online resource or it can be a face-to-face resource, are of course native speakers. Whether you're trying to find out what the source language says or trying to make sure that what you're about to say in the target language makes sense. But don't just ask any native speaker you come across, right? Your roommate or the person that lives next door or the owner of the restaurant. You need to make sure that, because we're asking about sophisticated linguistic and cultural questions, you need to make sure that that person has sort of the linguistic sophistication to understand what you're asking and to give you a correct answer. So be careful who you trust when you ask native speakers. So to summarize, in this video we've talked about the reformulation phase, which is kind of the key phase in translation. It's when you're actually solving those problems. You're looking at the problematic or not so problematic segments or units in the source text and trying to generate their equivalents in the target language for the target text. We talked about the different possible sizes of translation units and how that correlates possibly to translation approaches. We talked about translation procedures, just kind of gave an overview, and then we wrapped up with our discussion of these tools and resources that translators use. Hope you found it to be informative, and go back, rewind, pause, take some notes, make sure you're ready for that quiz in class tomorrow. See you then.